Without a doubt, we are living in interesting times. You know, if we were in China, living in interesting times would be considered a kind of bad omen. In fact, we had realized it, we noticed it. The sense that we were on the verge of a major imminent disruption had been with us for some time. The peculiar thing is that we had this feeling even when the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, the grain crisis, were still just eventualities, possibilities, not even that unlikely. Then, however, we had to enter restaurants only after showing a health QR code on our smartphones, which we had personalized and downloaded from the web. We wore masks, took university exams online, spent Christmas and other holidays in web conferences. If you think back to a few years ago, these experiences were very far from being common. And yet, driven by the urgency brought on by the pandemic, they became everyday occurrences in no time at all for everyone, not just for those who were experts in technology. The problem we face now is that we still don't fully understand how our lives have changed and, more importantly, how they will change as a result of these repeated shocks we are going through. And even less clear to us is what effect they have had, are having, and most importantly, will have on learning processes. It's obvious that reading history while living through it is never easy. However, there's one thing we should take for granted. We know that no matter how many all possible efforts are made, we can't go back. Moreover, we must take into account the fact that history, when it comes to the world of learning, teaches us that the learning processes of individuals often evolve and change in parallel or even ahead of educational systems, which tend to have greater inertia. That is, students often change. Students and people change the ways in which they learn before schools or universities change. This even happened with the advent of the printing press or the encyclopedist movement, which marked indeed in their own way and at different times the beginning of new cycles in education. With regard to education, let's try to rethink what has happened in the very early first decades of this century. A few years ago in universities, it seemed obvious that a tsunami, they actually used that word, the tsunami, was about to hit higher education. Something seemed to be coming, something rather worrying, that would radically and very quickly transform the entire landscape. I don't know if you remember, but those were exactly the words that accompanied the birth of the massive open online courses movement a few years ago, the MOOCs. That movement, led by major American universities that suddenly made well-designed online courses that are available, taught by experienced professionals, by the same professors who gave lectures at their large and very well-known universities, open to everyone and initially completely free. So, a few years later, what do we see? That MOOCs have reached extremely high user numbers, well beyond 250 million, not even counting Chinese users, for whom the data is not entirely reliable, but they could be comparable. They have certainly changed and had a significant impact on how we think about learning during and after university. And yet, we certainly haven't been swept away by a MOOC tsunami. They have continued to evolve along with the broader landscape, but at a measured pace. The saying fits well, festina lente, act swiftly but with caution. Think of the turtle with a sail, the dolphin with an anchor. Sailors, yes, but with great caution. But then, as we were saying a few years ago, the tsunami really did come. It wasn't the MOOC, but it took the form of a pandemic. And after the emergency of the first lockdown, when we had to completely focus on moving all teaching entirely online, the following period saw a shift toward new models of hybridization, of blending. We needed various mixes between remote teaching and in-person teaching to keep classrooms less crowded, to allow students who couldn't come to class to follow the lessons and sometimes for teachers to give them. With the passage of a considerable amount of time, we are coming to realize that, even though we have a strong desire to return to normality, the one we are indeed facing now is a new normal. As we said before, there's no going back. So what does this new educational context look like? It is characterized, first of all, by an unparalleled level of accessibility compared to what we had before in terms of digital tools and content. But what do we actually do with these digital tools and content? How do we integrate them into our teaching? This is still something we have to figure out. We need to invent the rules, the languages, the methods. And we are facing a true social fact, as Durkheim would say, of which, for now, we can only glimpse the potential. And we are certainly also very good at recognizing the risks, but we don't even have the words to define it. If you think about it, we use terms like hybrid, blended, on-life, extended, dual, enhanced, integrated, more or less interchangeably. We really haven't had the chance to stop and reflect, because as soon as the pandemic loosened its grip a little, the war began, the energy crisis, and climate change became more evident with the drought of 2022. In short, we all realize that sustainability is no longer just one of the options, but must be our top priority, absolutely. And what's the problem? That to fuel any transition that can help us face today's challenges, whether ecological, energy-related, digital, or whatever. I've even heard of a just transition. What we need, above all, is many more people who are able not only to take effective action, but also to think within these territories, which are new for everyone. And so now it's about training or upskilling in a way that must itself be sustainable, millions of citizens, students, and workers in a short amount of time. Furthermore, we must keep in mind that all these people, also because of the pandemic, have seriously questioned the traditional balance between private life, work, and study. The very need for flexibility has changed, along with the demand for control over one's choices and lifestyles, which we now want to be more ecologically sustainable. And this is where we come full circle. So, in such a context, how can we give up the potential of digital technology and everything we've learned about how to build effective blends between live and online, sync and async? It's not possible. In this context, it's simply not possible. And look, this isn't about taking sides for or against classroom-based teaching or online learning. It's about changing the way we think. It's about changing the way we think. It's about the intriguing concept of hybrid thinking to support the development of a high-quality educational offering, also sustainable on an increasingly broader scale, both national and international, using everything necessary to ensure quality and effectiveness in all learning experiences, in the classroom and online. And this is what we will cover in this MOOC.